Today, we're tackling a massive, incredibly complex geopolitical puzzle. We're going to unpack exactly how the European Union, the institution you probably associate with trade agreements, open borders, and regulations, is currently facing an absolutely unprecedented crisis. We are looking deep into the structural vulnerability of the EU, because as it turns out, the very foundation this entire institution was built on, it's cracking. And honestly, whether you live in Europe or halfway across the world, the global economic ripple effects are going to impact you. So, we're going to use the data and the history to show you exactly why this is happening. Let's get right into it.
Okay, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the threat from within, then move through the defense reality check, the energy and industry crisis, the demographic dilemma, and finally, the political gridlock.
Section 1. The threat from within. A stark warning.
So, picture this. At a recent Munich security conference, there was a brief pause in U.S. intelligence sharing with Ukraine. It lasted just 6 days, but that tiny window sparked a profound panic across European intelligence services. They quietly ran a private scenario, the kind they rarely discuss in public, and they realized, wow, we are fundamentally exposed. Look at this quote from the American vice president at that very conference. The shocking realization here is that Europe's biggest vulnerability isn't actually an external actor like Russia or China. No, the greatest threat is literally its own internal design.
And that internal design? Well, it was built on what we can call the 5 broken bets. Let's walk through this blueprint together. The entire European project functioned on a few massive assumptions. That America would always handle security, that incredibly cheap Russian gas would indefinitely power their factories, that China would just be this giant, lucrative market for European goods rather than a fierce rival, that birth rates would just naturally stay high enough to pay for their extensive welfare state, and finally, that democracy was a permanent one-way street for any new country joining the bloc. The problem? Every single one of these bets turned out to be wrong, and they all collapsed at the exact same time.
Moving on to Section 2, the defense reality check. The true cost of disarmament. For decades, the assumption that America would always be the shield led to some massive disarmament. To save money, NATO Europe slowly dismantled its militaries. Between 1990 and 2014, military manpower plummeted by roughly 50%. Major nations entirely ended conscription. So when the reality of the Ukraine war hit, Europe understandably panicked and announced this Rearm Europe initiative, slapping this massive €850 billion headline number on it. Sounds amazing, right? But actually, let's read the fine print. Of that $850 billion, only about $150 billion is actual newly borrowed money. The remaining $650 billion? That is merely permission. The EU is basically telling member states, hey, we'll waive the usual debt rules so you can borrow and spend your own money on defense. It's a big if, not a guarantee. But even if that money were real and ready to spend tomorrow, check out the stark contrast in output here. Europe's industrial base simply cannot absorb the cash fast enough to outbuild Russia. Take basic artillery shells. Europe spent 3 years scaling up to produce roughly 2 million shells a year. 2 million sounds like a lot, right? But in that same time, Russia scaled to about 7 million. Or look at air defense. The entire NATO alliance can produce maybe 1,000 high-end interceptors a year. Meanwhile, Russia is building up to 120 ballistic missiles, plus hundreds of thousands of drones. And keep in mind, it usually takes 2 or 3 interceptors to stop a single incoming missile. The math just completely breaks down for Europe.
And this right here brilliantly illustrates exactly why Europe's output is so low. It's the sheer cost of fragmentation. Russia basically focuses on producing one primary battle tank. Simple, streamlined. NATO Europe, on the other hand, they produce 17 different variants of 3 completely different tanks. There's absolutely no unified defense base. Everyone wants to build their own thing, and that lack of coordination literally cost Europe roughly 30% of its entire defense procurement budget in pure inefficiency.
Then, of course, we have the nuclear question. The EU has exactly one nuclear power, France, sitting on about 290 warheads. But we really need to define our terms here to understand why this isn't just some magic silver bullet. France has strategic nuclear weapons. These are massive yield weapons meant to wipe out cities and guarantee mutually assured destruction. What they lack are tactical nuclear weapons, smaller yields meant for a localized battlefield strike against a military hub. So, if a localized tactical strike were to happen in Eastern Europe, France's 290 strategic warheads provide theoretical deterrence, sure, but they offer zero proportional response. They can't launch a civilization-ending strategic strike over a tactical battlefield maneuver. The American nuclear umbrella historically covered this gap. France's explicitly national doctrine currently does not.
So, the fatal flaw in all of this is perfectly captured right here. Intelligence services estimate the threat horizon, meaning the point at which Russia might actually be ready to test NATO, is between 3 to 7 years from now. But the consensus to rebuild the European defense industrial base to a serious wartime footing, that's going to take 10 to 15 years. The threat arrives years before the defense industry is actually ready. You simply cannot outbuild a problem that has a massive head start.
All right, part 3, the energy and industry crisis, a strategic swap.
So, the second broken bet. The entire continental industrial model was perfectly calibrated for incredibly cheap natural gas, just piped straight in from Russia. When that supply disappeared almost overnight, the foundation of their entire industry went right along with it. Now, you might hear that Europe successfully decoupled from Russian gas, dropping it down to just 12%. And that's true, but they didn't actually achieve energy independence. They just executed a strategic swap. Notice the shift here. They traded a 45% Russian dependency for a massive 53% dependency on American liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
And the core issue with American LNG is that it is fundamentally more expensive. It costs more to extract, more to liquefy, more to ship across a giant ocean, and more to regasify on the other end. Because of this, EU industrial electricity is now twice the US rate and 50% above China's. We are literally watching deindustrialization happen in real time. BASF, the world's largest chemical company, recently closed a massive German plant, cut over 2,500 jobs, and decided to invest 10 billion euros in China instead. Volkswagen threatened to close German plants for the very first time in its 87-year history. It's simple, really. Industry inevitably moves to where energy is cheap. Which brings us right to the China bet. Europe assumed China would be a friendly market, not a fierce rival. But look at this electric vehicle dilemma. Chinese brands, like BYD, are rapidly overtaking the European auto industry in sales. They are eating them alive. So the EU tried to respond, proposing anti-subsidy tariffs on these Chinese EVs to level the playing field. But guess what happened? 5 countries, led by Germany, actually voted against the tariffs. Why on earth would they do that? Because legacy German automakers are still heavily exposed in the Chinese market, and they are terrified of retaliation. Europe is forced to compete with a rival that is winning in strategic industries, while internal EU interests remain totally divided.
Which leads us to Section 4, the demographic dilemma, the math of the welfare state.
Europe's entire social model. We're talking generous pensions, comprehensive health care, unemployment insurance, free university. It was all built for a population pyramid that required lots of young, healthy workers paying taxes to support a much smaller number of retirees. But that pyramid, it simply doesn't exist anymore. The EU's total fertility rate has dropped to 1.34 children per woman. That is the lowest level on record, and way, way below the 2.1 replacement level. And the data shows us that you can't just throw money at this to fix it. Really expensive pro-natal policies in places like Hungary and even South Korea have completely failed to reverse this trend.
So, facing this math, in 2015 Europe bet heavily on emigration to plug the gap. But look at the stark disconnect between policy and reality here. The assumption was that working-age arrivals would quickly integrate, get jobs, pay taxes, and offset that demographic shortfall. But the data reality proved otherwise. A 2023 study by the Dutch government's own policy bureau found that non-Western immigrants are actually a net fiscal negative over their lifetimes. And in Germany, 2024 data showed that 47% of basic welfare recipients held a foreign passport, even though they only make up 15% of the total population. So instead of providing a fiscal cushion to sustain the welfare state, the data is pointing to a growing fiscal hole.
And then there's the enforcement side of things. When authorities attempt to remove individuals who have no legal right to stay, they run into a massive legal bottleneck. Let's walk step by step through how this actually works. First, an asylum application is rejected, and a deportation is formally ordered. Okay? Second, the individual's home country simply refuses to issue new paperwork or accept them back. Third, the European Convention on Human Rights explicitly prohibits returning anyone to a potentially dangerous area. So, finally, step 4. Because they literally cannot be deported, EU law mandates the release of that individual right back into the host country. The authorities are structurally, legally paralyzed.
To really ground this huge structural issue, look at the tragic case of Anis Amri. This is the definition of a systemic failure. He was on a terror watch list, he had previous arson convictions in Italy, he was formally ordered deported.
But because his home country of Tunisia refused his paperwork twice, authorities were legally forced to release him in Germany. He later committed the devastating 2016 Berlin Christmas market truck attack. Now, to be clear, the vast overwhelming majority of immigrants are peaceful. But this specific anecdote highlights how the system completely fails to remove the very small fraction of people who legally, and for safety reasons, should not be there.
And this isn't just an isolated incident either. The scale of this enforcement gap is continent-wide. Just in Germany, there are around 50,000 people under active deportation orders that authorities simply cannot execute. Across the entire EU, only about 25% of all return orders are ever actually carried out. This massive enforcement gap creates immense political backlash from citizens, which in turn makes actually adapting to those core demographic labor needs nearly impossible.
Finally, Section 5. The political gridlock. Paralyzed by design.
So, the final broken bet was this rosy assumption that new member states would just flawlessly adopt and maintain democratic norms forever. Well, that hasn't happened. And the rules make it incredibly difficult to deal with. The core issue is what we call the unanimity bottleneck. EU foreign policy strictly requires a unanimous yes from all 27 member states. Think about that. One single country can freeze the entire continent's foreign policy during a crisis. Take Hungary. Their leadership maintains very close ties with Moscow. They're still signing long-term Russian gas deals. And more importantly, Hungary utilizes its veto power to repeatedly delay EU sanctions against Russia and block crucial weapons shipments to Ukraine.
Now you might be wondering, wait, doesn't the EU have a rule to punish a state that's actively obstructing everything? Well, yes, actually. It's called Article 7. But here is the giant loophole. The final sanction requires a unanimous vote from the other 26 states. The reality on the ground? 25 states will vote to sanction Hungary, but Slovakia consistently uses its single veto to protect them. And in return, Hungary protects Slovakia. So the crucial point here is that the system was specifically designed in a way that makes resolving internal obstruction mathematically impossible due to this mutual protection buddy system. It is literally paralyzed by design.
So, let's pull all of this together. We've seen how the 5 foundational bets on security, energy, China, demographics, and politics have simultaneously collapsed. From a fragmented defense base and completely upended energy models, to an unsolvable demographic math problem and a political system frozen by its own rules, the structural vulnerabilities are glaring. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. With 27 competing national interests, an industrial model built for a world that simply no longer exists, and a legal requirement for unanimity that guarantees paralysis, can the European Union actually adapt before time runs out? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this helped untangle the massive challenges facing the continent today.